looks like the one that I have edited and annotated, and we'll talk about that tonight. To get started, what I'd like to do is do a little bit of role playing with all of you for a few minutes, rather than diving right into the book, just to kind of get you situated here. What I'd like you all to do for a moment is imagine that you are all, once again, 10 years old. Now, since you were all 10 years old at some point in your life, it shouldn't be that hard to remember back to the kind of person you were. So imagine you're 10 years old, and imagine instead of waking up in a nice, cozy bed in a nice, cozy house in wherever you happen to live now. I grew up in the New Haven, Connecticut area, but I live in Western North Carolina at this point. Imagine that you find yourself waking up in a concentration camp. The date is January 1945, and the name of the camp is Auschwitz, which I'm sure you're all familiar with. The guards have just come into your barracks, and they're screaming, and they're shouting, and they're bellowing the command, Raus, Raus. And if any of you know German, you know the word Raus means out. Everybody out. We're going to evacuate this camp. So you and all the people in your barracks, you line up outside your barracks, you join this marching column that is already several miles long at this point. Slowly make your way out to the front gate, onto these back roads. And for the next 3 days, you march through the snow and ice and slush and mud in bitterly, bitterly cold temperatures, as only January in Eastern Europe can be like. And then on the third day, you reach a railhead. At that point, you are put on a cattle car. Cattle car has 4 sides, but it has no roof, it has no heat, it has no plumbing, it has no protection from the elements whatsoever. And you spend the next 10 days in that cattle car as this train that you're on slowly makes its way out of southwestern Poland, which is in this, where Auschwitz is located. Train takes a long detour, southerly detour through Czechoslovakia, then finally turns north into Germany and comes to a stop about 25 miles north of Berlin at another concentration camp, a camp called Sachsenhausen. And when you get there, you're grateful that you're still alive. Thousands of people died in the 2-week period in what became known in history as the Auschwitz Death March. They froze to death, they were shot if they couldn't keep up the pace. And when we talk about keeping up the pace, this column was marching at less than 1 mile per hour. I mean, it was basically just shuffling along. But some people couldn't even keep up that pace. But as I say, you're one of the lucky ones that has made it all the way to the end. But that doesn't mean that you're not suffering by this point. It doesn't mean you're not hurt as well. By the time you get to Sachsenhausen, you've got such severe pains in your feet and your legs that you can barely walk into the camp under your own power. But up until now, you dare not take off your boots to see what is wrong with your feet, to see what the source of this intense pain is, for a variety of reasons, including the fear that if you take off your boots, somebody will steal them from you. Remember, you're only 10 years old. And by this time, by January 1945, people are prepared to do literally just about anything to try to stay alive. It's a dog-eat-dog world. But now that you've made it into Sachsenhausen, you finally take off the boots you've been wearing now for at least 2 weeks continuously to see what's wrong with your feet, to see what the source of this pain is. And you look at your feet, and they no longer look like the palm of my hand. Your feet are no longer flesh-colored. They've turned completely black. Black from a severe case of frostbite. In fact, so severe that the flesh on your toes is already starting to rot away. So you know you have to go to the infirmary. The German word for the infirmary in these camps was the Revier. You know you have to go to the Revier to get some medical attention. I mean, I'm sure you agree that sounds logical. When you and I get sick, we get medical attention. We go to the doctors. If we get injured, we fall off a ladder. We go to the emergency room to see what's wrong. But in the crazy, upside-down, illogical world of the concentration camp, the Revier was actually considered the most dangerous place you could go. The prisoners actually called it the waiting room for the gas chamber. Because if you think about it, if you're lying in a hospital bed, you're not working. If you're not working in a camp, then you're not earning your way. And you're not justifying the meager resources that the camp is using to keep you alive in the first place. But you also know that if you don't go to the Revier, number one, you cannot function because of this constant pain. And you know that sooner or later you're either going to get an infection or you're going to get gangrene. And in either case, you're going to die from it. So you screw up your courage. You go to the infirmary hoping for a good result. And luckily for you that day, there is a kindly doctor on duty, a fellow prisoner. In fact, he was a Norwegian at the time. He takes one look at your feet, picks you up right by the scruff of your clothes. Remember, you're only 10 years old. You're like a waif, a child. Carries you over to an operating table right there, gives you some ether to knock you out. And the next thing you know, you're waking up and you realize you're lying in a hospital bed in the infirmary. And you look down at your feet and you see that they're both heavily bandaged. And the orderlies in that hospital ward explain to you that the doctor had to amputate some of your toes in order to try to save your feet from further infection. So now you're lying in this bed wondering, how long can I stay here before a Nazi doctor sees me? You know, what's a Nazi doctor going to say when he sees a 10-year-old child using up a hospital bed? So while those somber thoughts are going through your mind, of course, prisoners are streaming through the infirmary practically on a 24-hour basis. By the spring of 1945, Sachsenhausen had a prisoner population of approximately 35,000 people. I mean, it was the size of a small city. And these prisoners are coming in for all sorts of reasons. Some of them are coming in to get some medical attention for themselves. Some of them are coming in because they're visiting their friends who are sick there. Some come in just to get out of the cold. I mean, remember, it's January and it's freezing outside. And even if you end up getting a beating from a guard because you're not supposed to be there, it's better to get a beating and have some warmth than it is to slowly and surely freeze to death sometimes outside. As I say, these prisoners are streaming through at all times, and they're paying absolutely no attention to you. They're ignoring you. And after all, they don't know who you are. You're not from their family. You're not a cousin. You're not from their village. In many cases, you probably can't even speak the same language that they can, so they can't even communicate with you. So everybody's ignoring you. And then one day, a middle-aged man comes into the infirmary because he's going to visit one of his friends who is sick. And instead of walking right by you and ignoring you like everybody else is, he stops. He starts talking to you. He can speak the same language you speak. In this case, it was German. And he asks you, child, what's your name? Where did you come from? Do you know where your parents are? Do you have any siblings, any brothers and sisters? In fact, do you have any friends? Do you know anybody in this camp at all? In other words, unlike any other person, at least this one individual is showing some interest in you and in your situation. Now, why am I telling you this story? Well, the first reason is that that's because it's a true story. The young child that was talking about, describing there, was a boy named Thomas Bergenthal. That's a picture of Tommy taken in 1938 when he was 4 years old. And Tommy would be arrested in late 1939, along with his mother and father, and held as a prisoner of the Nazis for the entire duration of World War II for no other crime other than the fact that he was a Jew. The person who stopped to talk to him was a man named Odd Nansen. Now, the second reason why I'm telling you this story is that chance meeting between these two people back in early February 1945 changed both of their lives. And when I say this was a chance meeting, again, I've already told you, 35,000 prisoners are in this camp, and most of them are segregated by nationality. So the Norwegians are in one place, the Czechs, the Polish, everybody else is in different barracks. And in fact, Sachsenhausen was so large that it had not one, but 4 different reviers, known as Revier 1, 2, 3, and 4. And when Tommy was operated on and had his toes amputated, he was put in Revier number 3 to recover. And it just so happened that Nansen's friend, who was sick, his name was Henry Hansen, was in Revier number 3. So if Tommy had been in 1 or 2 or 4, it's likely that Nansen never would have bumped into him, never would have seen him, and they never would have been into each other at all. But as I say, that chance meeting changed both their lives. In Tommy's case, it literally meant the difference between life and death. Because from that day forward, Nansen used his food and tobacco rations to bribe the orderlies to look out for Tommy, to protect him, to make sure that his name did not show up on the periodic selection lists that had to continually be drawn up to send people off to the gas chamber to make room for more sick prisoners. Now, some of you may ask, how does Nansen have enough food that he can be giving it away in the form of bribes to these orderlies? I thought everybody in these camps was starving. How could he possibly survive if he was giving away what meager rations he had? But that's not really an accurate picture of what life in these large concentration camps was like. They were very highly stratified, and they were stratified by race. Because the way the Nazis viewed the world was through the lens of race. To them, race was the most important defining characteristic of a person, of an event. It kind of helped them to understand the world, and it also determined how they would treat the world. And in what the Nazis called their Weltanschauung, which means their worldview, of course, the Nazis believed that they were the Herrenvolk. The Herrenvolk means the master race. They were the Aryan race. They were superior racially to everybody else, and they were destined to rule this new world order that they were trying to create in occupied Europe. At the bottom of that totem pole, of course, the Nazis put the Jews. They considered to be Untermenschen, subhumans, fit for nothing other than ultimately being exterminated. But the Nazis had to find a place in this pecking order for every race. We would call them mostly nationalities, so that they could deal with them, so they would know in what order, in what rank they should view them. And the Nazis looked at the Scandinavian prisoners, not only the Norwegians, but also the Danes. And they said, in many ways, you are racially akin to us. You're almost like our first cousins racially. I mean, you're not Aryan because you're not Germanic, but you're tall, you're blonde haired, you're blue eyed. So you could practically be a poster child for what we consider to be an Aryan. So if we're Aryan and we're here, we're going to kind of put you Nordics, is what they call them, just really one notch below us and certainly ahead of everybody else. We think you're racially superior to the French, the Greeks, the Romanians, the Slavs, whatever. And by virtue of the fact that the Nazis looked up in many ways to the Scandinavians, not as much as they considered themselves, but compared to all the other prisoners in these camps, they allowed them one benefit that they did not allow to any other prisoners. That is, they allowed them to receive food parcels from the Red Cross. And if you had food in a concentration camp, you are rich, because the only currency in the camp that means anything to anybody is food. Most of the people are, in fact, starving. So if you've got food, you can get anything from anybody. In fact, one of the first questions that's almost always asked of me is, how did Nansen get his hands on paper to write this diary? And I say, with food, Nansen could get anything he wanted. Sachsenhausen even had a brothel operating inside the concentration camp, run by the Nazis. But you needed food to get access. So Nansen had the wherewithal to help Tommy by virtue of the food that he could then turn around and use as bribes to keep Tommy alive. But I said a few minutes ago that this chance meeting changed both their lives. In Nansen's case, he really wasn't suffering from any medical problem, any health-related issue, and there really wasn't much that a 10-year-old child can do for a middle-aged man. But I think if you read Nansen's diary, and you go back to it, I think reading between the lines, you almost have to come to the conclusion that by the spring of 1945, that Nansen was heading for a mental breakdown. The tone of his diary entries are much more distressed than they have ever been before that. It's almost like he's kind of running out of mental energy. He's been in concentration camps at that point for over 3 years. He has seen every kind of brutality, every kind of sadistic practice, every kind of horrific treatment of people that you can imagine. And it's driving him, I think, slowly nuts. And so this is what Nansen wrote about meeting Tommy. This is not in his diary. This is in a book that he wrote after the war. He said, "Everywhere I went in the camp, Tommy's angelic face popped up. Without suspecting it, Tommy accomplished with us a work of salvation. He touched something in us which was about to disappear. He called to life again human feelings, which were painful to have. but which nevertheless meant salvation for us all. So I think meeting Tommy and having as his kind of goal of keeping Tommy alive gave Nansen that purpose that he needed to get through those final agonized months of the war.